Hello and welcome to this edition of the Christian Recorder Dialogues. As you know, over the last quadrennium, we have been celebrating several bishops who will be leaving the active service in 2024. And we have with us today my bishop, the Right Reverend E. and Henning Byfield. You can say what the E is, Bishop. We won't put that in there and full government name out. We are delighted to have you with us today, just to talk about your episcopacy, talk about your episcopacy, talk about the what you've done with the church, and just give us a capstone interview of what's been going on. So, as always, we invite you to put your name in the chat. We ask you to just share with us and let us know that you're here. So, Bishop, welcome to TCR Dialogues. This is not your first time with us, but this show is all about you. So, thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. I am excited. Once I was elected a bishop, my name became Elizabeth Ann. So it's no secret that they call your full name when you are elected. My mother's name was Elizabeth, and so I was never called by that. But I'm excited for this dialogue. A little nervous, a little anxious, but excited about this dialogue.
Well, Bishop, we thank you for taking time to be with us. So first, I just want to start talking about your call to the ministry, because, you don't begin as a bishop, and you don't begin as a preacher. You have to be called to these positions. So, Bishop, first, let's talk about how you were called to the ministry. We know that you come from a family of preachers, but everyone has their own calling. So talk to us about your call to the ministry.
So no one in my family, I think, expected me to have a call to ministry. One, I think, is because I was a girl. My father instilled in my brothers. So I have two brothers that were in ministry, and my sister married a preacher. And so mine was evolving. I've always been active in church life, YPD, or all of that. In 1965, at the quadrennial session of the YPD in Pittsburgh, I got into a debate with a speaker who was putting down girls, saying that we would not be successful if we didn't learn how to take care of our men and our husbands. And so after this really lively debate, and he couldn't win it, so he ended up just dismissing me. A woman came up to me and said, you have a call to preach. And I looked at her and fell out laughing. I was like 14, 15. So that wasn't anything that pleased me or excited me to do so. It was then several years later when I was in Columbus and I started attending the Nation of Islam. And one of the ministers said to me, you could be one of the first female spokesman here in Columbus. And I fell out laughing because I wasn't in the Nation of Islam for religious purposes. I was there for political and social. And when I moved to Indianapolis, I started feeling an urge to do more than what I was doing as a YPD director or Christian education. And so I entered seminary, not to be a preacher, but to be a Christian educator. And it was in my first semester of seminary that I ended up accepting the call to preach. So that was 1975. But it took me 4 sermons before my church would license me.
4 sermons?
4 sermons. I said, I must have the record. When I acknowledged the call to my pastor, who was my brother-in-law, Reverend Walter Parks, he began the series of which is what I learned from. He began the series of dialogue with me with prayer and so forth. And another minister who was a wisdom voice for me said to him, I knew she had a call. Can she come do a revival, a 3-night revival? And so he went to the stewards. The stewards said, sure. And that they would use that as my sermon, since it was 3 nights. When he brought my name before the stewards to present to the church conference, they turned it down. They said, no, we said that, but she should preach in her church. And so they would not license me until I preached a fourth sermon in St. Paul AME Church, and that was then started my official ministry.
Wow, that I've not heard of a journey like that before, and I want to stay here for a second. Now, you mentioned that I do this, but for those who may not have known, you were in the nation. So can you just talk a little bit about, like, from the book from Base of Islam to AME Bishop? That could be like a book, but how did you get to the Base of Islam?
Well, I'm clear now that it was grief, but it was a combination of grief and where I stood politically. So, grief, my father died, and I began to question the church. I never really questioned God. I questioned the church. But Malcolm X appeared on the scene, and I loved Malcolm X. I loved Malcolm X more than I did Martin King at that time. And so I began to want to hear more from Malcolm X. I went to the nation. I never joined. I never liked Elijah. I mean, it was like I went for Malcolm X. And when the minister came to me and said, you've been hanging around us, and I was wearing my hair wrapped, my dress is long, and he said, you really need to make a commitment to come into the nation, formally. And the Jesus in me kicked in. So as we talked, and I never thought Allah was a greater God. I never thought that Muhammad was greater than Jesus. I never thought Elijah was the modern day and it was out of that reflection and discussion that I decided, no, I need to go. So I didn't go to church for maybe 2 years because I was I wasn't happy with what I was seeing in the Black church, and I wasn't happy with what I was seeing in Islam. And so it was when I moved to Indianapolis and went to church with and this is really quick, my sister brought me back to the church, because when I moved to Indianapolis, I wasn't going to church. And I wasn't going to Islam, I wasn't going to church. And so she just kept nagging every week, yo mama and yo daddy, you better come to church. And so eventually I did. And then within a year after I came back, I was called to preach. I accepted the call to preach.
Wow. And of course, after you accepted this call, this began a long trajectory in ministry, not only as a pastor, but as a presiding elder. So, Bishop, give us some of the highlights from your career in the pastorate and the presiding eldership.
So when I saw that question, I was like, wow, what does that mean? So I think for me, I've always blended deep spirituality and social justice. And spiritual formation in one group. So I always believed in evangelism. I always believed in church growth, and I always believed in the community and the church were wedded together. So looking at that, I would say that some of the things that I probably did was the social justice stuff. So I was one of the first pastors, I was the first AME pastor in Indiana, and one of the first pastors, period, in Indiana that adopted an HIV/AIDS, where we ministered to them wholly, completely, passing out condoms, providing medicine, having partners for them. I was the first that openly said, the LGBT community were welcome in the congregation. It caused some dissension in terms of some of the members, but eventually we came to accept and love everyone. I started a school, and in every church I had some form of community outreach, usually called the Village House, at 2 of them, but we did everything. So domestic violence, support, violent death, to family support for violent death. And then, so that was always there. It was always balanced with evangelism. I won several years in a row the Connectional evangelism award for the number of people. And then
Soul
the personal,
goals. Yeah.
yeah. So the personal things then would be, I preached at Wesley Seminary, Wesley Church Chapel in London when I was still a pastor. I was named over and over like the top 10 pastors or one of the 4 influential pastors across denominations. And so it's that combination. As an elder, I just elevated what I did to the church as a pastor. And so I developed Christian education resources for my district. I started a a sports camp for children to do more than basketball and football, and established 2 churches as an elder. One of them is still really strong. So I was hard pressed to come up with one thing, but it is the combination of evangelism. Now, I was the first female pastor in the connection to Pastor St. Paul, which had 900 members. So the other 2 females that had significant membership, Bishop Guidry pastored, her church was like 700. And I think Bishop McKenzie, when she went to Payne, was about 600 or 700. And then I was the first to go to a church where they had 900 on roll, and we know in AME numbers that wasn't real. So I think that it's hard to be self-reflective, but I think that was a combination. Now I do like the fact that before I was a bishop,
Go ahead.
Before I was a bishop, I had preached in Africa, I had preached in Europe, and I had preached in the Caribbean, even as a pastor.
Now, I would say I think you because as someone who's followed your career, someone who's walked with you all through some of this space, just I think you pretty much summed it up right. I mean, the holistic ministry. I mean, I think we'd be hard pressed to find a sitting bishop who goes. You set the standard, I think, for holistic ministry. I think we could find various bishops who have done what you've done, but I don't really think that anyone has surpassed, this holistic piece, this looking at the whole person. And that's something that definitely stands out because you were in Indianapolis. I mean, and I remember at your retirement, you talked about what it meant to be in an urban area with Black folk and what it meant to stand in the border, stand up for Black people in that space. So I really think that the holistic ministry definitely encapsulates you. Bishop, we're going to go to our first sponsor, someone who the Reverend Dr. Kenneth Golphin, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about what set you on the road to be a bishop.
Sure.
Greetings in the name of Jesus, our Savior and our Redeemer. I am Kenneth Golphin, presiding elder of the Bluegrass District of the Kentucky Conference in the 13th Episcopal District, as well as pastor of Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Shelbyville, Kentucky. After prayerful consideration and consultation with my elders, I believe that God has called me to make this candidacy for the office of General Secretary and Chief Information Officer of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. There's a story told in the Old Testament of Joshua. Joshua was a servant leader. He was a servant of God. He was a servant of Moses. He was a servant of the people. He did not try to move ahead of Moses. He did not try to usurp responsibility, but he did what God called him to do. And after God had allowed him to serve in one capacity for a number of years, he became the leader of the people. I have served under Bishop Clement Few when he was General Secretary of the church for 12 years, from 2000 to 2012. And since 2012, I have served with Dr. Jeffrey Cooper as recording secretary on his staff. And I believe that God has prepared me to move upwards to the office of General Secretary. I solicit your prayers, I solicit your support, I solicit your vote, and ask you to consider Kenneth Golphin as General Secretary and Chief Information Officer of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 2024. Thank you, and God's peace.
And we're back, and we're always thankful for our sponsors who help us to give you this quality programming. So, Bishop, so you were called to the pastorate. You had an excellent career as a pastor and a presiding elder, but you know, even though the Bible tells us to seek the office of bishop is a good thing, we know that without a true calling to the office of bishop, you know, it may not be the best thing. But we know that the Lord spoke to you to be called for the office. So tell us, what motivated you to be led to be a bishop?
So it was evolving. I don't know that I can remember that I had this moment of this is it, go seek the office of bishop. When I became a presiding elder, I have a stubborn streak. And so when I started pastoring, it took me 3 years from the time I was ordained as an itinerant elder. And when I went to my third church, when I went to my first church, I didn't want to go, but I went and had a successful. When I went to my last church, I wasn't all that excited about moving, but the Lord blessed. So when Bishop Cousin appointed me as a presiding elder, he said to me, when Bishop Thomas appointed me to St. Paul, he said, we're putting you in line for greater things in the AME Church. It never dawned on me that was to be a bishop. When Bishop Cousin appointed me as an elder, and I was stubborn. I was like, I don't want to do this. He said similar kinds of things. And he was thinking that I would become a general officer. So when I started as presiding, somewhere later in my presiding elder, I started having this evolution for more, much like it was in ministry. And I sought a couple of people, and then I decided in my head that they would never elect a sibling of a bishop who was still serving. And so that was my out. No, I couldn't be. When Bishop Bryan came to the district, and he and I had a very introspective conversation, and he said, have you ever felt like it or thought of it? And I was like, nah, not really. And so when he laughed and he said, okay, we'll wait. That's how he said it. We'll wait. So when I finally came out in 2011, a year before, no, it was not a year, about 18 months before the General Conference, I wasn't overwhelmed about it, but I felt that the Lord had said so and that the time was right. So when the question of my education became a challenge, I was in a doctoral program, but we won't go to that today. And I decided then that I had misread God. And so when it was clear the second time around, because I wasn't going to come back out, and we can talk about that when we talk about my brother, I realized I wanted to serve the church in greater ways. And if I can say it this way, because it wasn't egotistic, it was I wanted to do what I did as a presiding elder at a larger range. So I wanted to see churches grow. I wanted to see new members. I wanted to see community and church together. I wanted to see all of that. And that was what motivated me finally to do so.
And one thing here that I don't want to get lost in the conversation is the spiritual piece. One of the things that I think when we look over your episcopacy that I think all our fathers and mothers of the church are spiritual and have spiritual gifts. But as a church, we know that there are different manifestations of these gifts. And I think for you, I'll never will forget when I was sitting in the Dominican Republic and just saw you ministering the Spirit. And I don't think that comes out sometimes, like, you know, in how you speak and how you share, but the spirituality that you have. Can you just talk a little bit about this spirituality and how it's come out in your ministry before we talk about Bishop Henning?
Okay, so from a negative standpoint, I have always felt out of place. I felt as if persons who have spirituality or spiritual formation, or for lack of a better word, charismatic kinds of gifting, that they're often diminished in the church. So we have this notion that once you become a bishop, that there is this more intellectual and spiritual, not electoral and administrative, than it is. Bishops have to be discerning. Bishops have to be worshipers. And they are. I mean, you know, in art. So for me, I just didn't know anything else. So I learned. I got the gift of tongues at an AME meeting at the age of 20. You understand? So being an AME and being charismatic, being an AME and being gift of healing, being an AME, being discerning, being an AME and doing all of that was never a contradiction for me. When I got on the connectional scene, I found that somehow we diminish it, and people would say to me, "Now, where did you come from? You know, because why are you doing this?" When I became a presiding elder, I did it a little freer. But when I became a bishop, it was like, and I'm in countries that are poorer than poor, but they love God. And so it was then when I was a bishop in the 16th district, coupled with the deep spirituality in mind, it just exploded. So so in the only countries that sometimes I won't say that was difficult, but it was the English speaking. It was the deep English speaking, hard British lifestyle countries that had problems with it. But nah, and coming to the 13th, it has not been a problem.
So we mentioned this earlier, so let's delve into this. So you are the first sister of a bishop to be elected as a bishop. And I remember that photo because we were elected around the same time. So remember that photo in the back with you and Bishop Henning, you know, and for all of y'all who may not know this, Bishop Henning, my family church is St. John AME, and my father was one of the stewards for Bishop Henning and Bishop Henning Byfield's father. So that's a whole that could be another interview. But so can you reflect on the relationship between yourself and Bishop C. Garnett Henning and how that influenced your episcopacy?
Okay, so let me put it again in context. I had two brothers, Garnett and JP, who were preachers, and I had my brother-in-law. My foundational into ministry, other than what I gleaned as a child, came through my brother-in-law, who was my father. My brother JP and I pastored in the same district, and at one point pastored in the same conference. And so he became this daily mentor. Garnett was always the distant mentor. He was the person that I talked to when I needed. So I have to explain it this way because it's funny. JP always gave me the everyday preacher advice. Garnett always gave me the high advice, right? So when I needed the high advice, I go to Garnett. When I need to know how to deal with church Negroes or church people, I went to JP, right? Or Walter. So when I became a presiding elder, it's when my relationship in ministry was with Garnett. It was So I needed someone who could do administration, could do multiple, what do you do in a church? And so it was out of that, and particularly, he was already a bishop. And so he helped and he followed me and supported me. When I decided that I was going to be a bishop, Garnett did not. So Garnett was like, I've been waiting on this, right? I mean, that was his approach to it. But he allowed Bishop Brian, who was my bishop, to take the lead. And again, the relationship was sort of back, a little backward, stand back, you come to me, not you take. It was when the Judicial Council denied my candidacy that my relationship with Garnett completely changed. He became my pastor. He called me on a regular basis. He prayed, he cajoled, he fussed at me, talked about, you the preacher, get out of bed, stop going through depression, and was really great in that sense. And when I said I'm coming back out, he was just there. So when I became a bishop, the person that I talked to, in addition to my father and Episcopal Bishop Ryan, was Garnett. So at my first conferences, Garnett was there. When I talked about appointments, I talked a lot to Garnett, and he always would say, "Well, whatever the Lord, you know." So he would never impose, but he would just throw out. So serving as a bishop, without Garnett in the room, can be very difficult some days. But he was just brilliant in learning to help me navigate without telling me what to do. And because he himself was a social justice activist, he himself was a liturgist, he himself was, and he doesn't, again, we typecast people. So we typecast them in certain areas, but Garnett was a liturgist. My father was a liturgist. Garnett was a Christian educator. We have now found the papers that he had written on deep theological principles. And so I miss him greatly, but he is always, he emerged to be the wisdom voice more than occasional discussion.
Yes, yes. And I remember the Afrocentricity of Bishop Henning. And the whole, and I know it's not just it's the whole Henning family. It's the whole Henning, and then by proxy, the Lee family that married into the Henning family. But I never will forget that funeral. And people were like, there are libations and drummers? What is going on here? But if you knew the Bishop Henning's family, you would have known that was what was going to happen. And it was just so refreshing to see in fame, in First AME Church, drummers coming in, the libations being offered. And just that I think, this is something that will always stay with me. And just, I think is a tribute to who he was and what he did for the church. Because, those who knew his ministry or the church experienced his ministry, Henning was, he was a brain. He was a big brain. He just was he was a deep thinker. And that's something that definitely is missed. Definitely.
And he certainly loved Africa.
Yes.
He had a deep commitment to the fairness and justice and equity of Africa in the AME Church. And he and Bishop Sinodley founded the precursor to the Global Development Council. And that was always, he founded at AME University, which has now become the largest AME school in the connection. And so he was just brilliant. He was just brilliant, but he did it so effortlessly that a lot of people miss it.
Yeah. Well, Bishop, we're going to go to our next commercial break, and then we're going to delve into your Episcopal career.
All right.
My name is Gregory Eason, a candidate for Episcopal service in 2024. Leadership determines the moral and spiritual environment in which the church operates. With over 40 years in ministry and 37 years as a pastor, you can count on me to do what is right and lead with integrity and fiscal accountability. I'm a bridge builder and will respect and celebrate the senior leadership of our church while mentoring and providing opportunities for our up-and-coming leaders. I'm a proven supporter of women in ministry and our laity and all the components of our church. It's a season for proven leadership. Eason for Bishop.
So, Bishop, you've taken us up to your episcopacy. We've talked about that moment. I'll never forget the moment, the photo when Bishop Henning was one of the 7 laying his hands on you for the consecration. So let's talk about some of the highlights in your episcopal career and the districts you've served.
Okay. So when I came to the 13th district, somebody introduced me and said that she's come home to get a legacy. And I sort of laughed about, well, I thought I had one before I came. If I could sum one thing that I want to be remembered for, that I consider highlight, is Cuba. I planted 13 churches in my ministry, 10 of them when I served the 16th district. Actually, I've served now because I've planted 2 here in the 13th. And I was burdened by Cuba. I prayed when I was elected that I would get into Cuba. And the Lord opened the door, as you well know, with a Brazilian who started the church. We had started a church in Bahia, and he was Cuban. And he had a Cuban friend who was stranded in Suriname. And he hooked up with the AME preacher in Suriname. And out of that came the reestablishment of the church in Cuba that had not been established since 1961, since the revolution, 1960. So that would be key for me, just absolutely key for me. The second is planting churches in countries that we did not have churches before. Bishop White had opened the door for Brazil. And so there were the churches that we brought in under my administration in the Rio area. But we established also in Bahia 2 churches that are still doing well. We went to, oh God, I can't think, the other church, the other country.
Belize,
thank you. So we established, we established a church in Belize, Tabernacle of Praise, which is doing well. And then we established 2 in Dominican, and we established 1 in Haiti, 1 or 2 in Haiti. And the only one that really didn't survive was the one we started in Jamaica. So that's really key for me. That's really important for me. The second, I think, for me is ministering in crisis. So in the 16th district, as you well know, there's always crisis. It's hurricanes, it's locusts, it's mudslides. And to be able to do that and to rebuild churches that had been destroyed by that. Outside of the 16th district, being the president of the Council of Bishops, I won't call it a highlight, but it did show me that God puts you in places that you never thought and how you handle it. So being coming in as the president of the council in 2021, we had the crisis of getting 14 to 20 to the General Conference. That was so the day that I was elected, the day that I was president, the next day that the General Conference Commission called and said, now what are we going to do with this? Secondly, it was the second day, it was all these lawsuits that were going around the country and federal investigation. It had nothing to do with the annuity issue. And then after the uproar of the General Conference, the not being in the same room, and then presiding the night when some of the appointments from the Episcopal Committee, raised confusion, and then to find out that we got an annuity crisis, right? I survived, and the church survived. I never thought that I did anything significant with the annuity crisis, except that people started saying to me, we did not die. The ship did not shipwreck. You kept us moving so that we could do some other things. The other things that happened as a president of the council that doesn't get noted, I initiated the first Connectional Prison Reform Committee, of which Bishop Brookins is the chair, that started under me the initiation of the Lenten prayer that the bishops would do during the Lenten season. That has been significant, that I remember and enjoy. And then doing the mission trips when I was a bishop, but then coming to the 13th, it's taken all those same things at different levels. And so we have initiated the Faith in Action, which is a mission group that every time we go to a city as a district meeting, we go into the community and do some things. We've started 2 churches here. One is really doing very well, the other one. And then finally, I think it's the signing of the MOU with Asbury, where they're going to be doing some significant training in the district. So I think for me, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, continue.
So I think for me, but if somebody said to me, what are you really, really excited about? I just think Cuba. I just, we could have done more in Cuba if we had more money. I was invited to Italy to start a church, met with the pastors, never got to Italy. They came to a conference, and the moment that I was going to go to Italy, the pandemic hit. And I actually have reached out to Bishop Sanders, and I reached out to some of the people I know to see if Bishop, somebody can bring them in to the connection. And Scotland, which is really strange. A lot of Africans have moved to Scotland, so they've asked us. We've been asked to start, when I was there, to start a church in Dubai. And all of that happened right at the pandemic, and I just didn't. So hopefully somebody else will do that.
And Bishop, there are 2 things that I want to pick up on before we hit our final commercial and then our final question. The first thing, I remember in 2008 when I was helping Bishop Sarah Davis do legislation for the 16th district, and they were redoing the boundaries, and you have to send everything to the General Conference, and Cuba was not on the list. She was adamant that Cuba not be taken off the list because she said, we never abandoned Cuba and we will get back to Cuba. So
wow.
Yes, she I never will forget that. She was adamant. She said, we will not delete Cuba. We will get back to Cuba. So
and that was because of that, though. It was so the law in Cuba was, if you had a church in Cuba before the revolution, you could come back if you could prove that you had a church. And of course, a lot of the churches in Cuba are still getting, I mean, some of the churches that were there gone into hiding because of that. But it was the discipline that we could show that in 1956, there were members of Cuba, there was a Cuban delegation at the General Conference. We could show that they were members of various committees, and we could show that the Cuba was still in the boundaries. And that was part of what gave rise to the government letting us back in.
And so that's the first piece. And the second piece, education. I know the irony being that, we know the great irony about the education credentials of 2012, but you've had the privilege of serving as the chancellor of one institution and on the board of another. So can you briefly talk about what it's meant to be the chancellor of your alma mater, Wilberforce University, and be on the board of your other alma mater, Payne Seminary?
Okay, so I was on the board of Payne under Bishop Cousins. So I've been on the board of Payne and then came off for a period and went back on. You can't imagine the joy of being on as the chancellor. So if I had a moment of introspection, I never felt like I was a scholar. I felt like to be a scholar, you had to have a PhD, right? To be a scholar, you had to have all of this research. And so to have people say to me, "You're a scholar," I reject initially. But being on the board of Wilberforce and being the chancellor, it's really gratifying. I've been sending students to Wilberforce for many years as a pastor. We've paid for them to go, but to see the evolution of the school, to see it come back, to see the number of students have jumped to 100 since the leadership has changed, to see we're getting ready to put a Starbucks in this fall.
What?
Yes, we are. So to see the number of PhDs who are coming in to teach, who in the last 10 years. So I'm just excited. It's the kind of thing that you say to God, how did this happen? And I'm grateful. Being on Payne is the same feeling and again, this year I was able to see a young lady from the 16th district to graduate that we started her, and thank God that Bishop Zanders continued that, and to see Payne at its zenith with the number of D-men, the number of MDivs, it's just very gratifying. And that is one of the things of which I am just very humbled in the sense of I never thought so. I wanted to teach, but I never thought so. To be able to teach preaching at Colgate, Rochester, CRCD, to be able to go back to Payne and teach, it's just, I don't know what to say. I'm just grateful. I'm just thankful.
Well, Bishop, and I just want to hit on the scholar thing before we get our final commercial, and then we wrap up. As someone who has a PhD, who's someone who spends my life, writing and doing stuff around scholars, I think we throw that word around a lot. And I mean, Black people have been doing scholarship before we had access to these degrees, before we had access to these ivory tower places. And having a PhD does not make you a scholar. It is about, what you have done with your work and done with your research and the love for life. Like I remember, seeing one of my pastor, by one of my early pastors, I think it was Reverend Adkins from St. John. His library was so big because, back in the day, you had to have a big preaching library. And I think even though we have all these degrees right now, I would dare say we had better love for scholarship years ago when people were, I think, had a higher intellectual curiosity than what I'm seeing right now. So no, Bishop, I would concur that you are a scholar and a hymn writer. We're not going to get to the hymn writing, but you are like one of the who's actually written hymns that are being sung. And I remember when they did the medley of hymns written by AME bishops. And again, we don't think of our bishops as writing hymns, and we have several bishops who are written hymns. Most recent of them is you. So we're going to hit our final commercial break, then we're going to hit our final question.
Greetings in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus the Christ. I am Barbara Chisholm, a servant pastor in the 7th Episcopal District. Today I have come before you to ask your support and vote in my aspiration of becoming a bishop at the General Conference in 2024. My sisters and brothers, we are at a critical crossroad where we are able to bring about real change during this epidemic of misinformation and mistrust. We can embrace it as an opportunity where we are able to reshape, revitalize, and create new pathways for the future that will be stronger, better, and greater, or we may continue to do the same thing we've always done, getting the same results, and I call this insanity. You may ask me, how can we rebuild and bring about real change? Number one is trust. Continuing to trust God and elect new bishops who can earn your trust. Number two, elect new bishops who will hear the voice of laity and pastors and respond to the needs of the people. Number three, electing new bishop who will value people as priority above all else. Yes, I believe we can rebuild AME stronger, better, and greater. And I believe it begins within you and I. I am the Reverend Dr. Barbara Chisholm in becoming a bishop.
Rebuilding AME starts with Reverend Dr. Barbara Chisholm, Becoming Bishop 2024. Your vote matters.
I am the Reverend Dr. Barbara Chisholm, and I approve this message.
Well, we know it's campaign season, and we are thankful for our candidates who have shared these broadcasts. But Bishop, as we draw to the close of our interview, you're retiring from the active ministry, but you don't retire from ministry until when you retire. So as you move into this new season of ministry for you, what's next?
I wrote a blog many years ago called "Writing is Its Own Reward," and I like to write. I have so many projects that I haven't finished. That is my writing and teaching and grandkids. So we're moving back to Indianapolis. In the time that I've been elected bishop, particularly since I've been out of the country, they're growing, and I've missed some key parts of their growth, and so I want to spend that time with them. But I just want to teach and write, and hopefully somebody will invite me to preach every now and then. But basically, I have my dissertation that I just never got to print on the impact of short notice appointments. And then I have a couple other pieces, but mainly to write. The writing was always a form of relaxation for me. It was a form of creativity. And so I'm amazed at my retiring that when people introduce me, they introduce me more about my creativity in writing, which sort of, it's like, oh, okay. and but I'm doing more and more of that, and doing something with the music that I have, all these songs. So basically, relax, rest, and write, teach. I'll still be teaching at Colgate. I'll be teaching a class called Prophetic Black Preaching, and some other schools we're negotiating. But that's it. That's just to enjoy.
Okay, good. And before we close, I have to ask about your hair, because you made this post on Facebook about what am I going to do next? And I know your locks and your hair have been a journey, so I have to ask the question that everyone on Facebook was asking: so what's next with your hair? You know, because I remember when you did the big.
I'm not
so tell us
real
about that
sure. I'm leaning toward locks again,
Mhm.
but my hair now is softer and becomes harder to lock. But I think maybe, yeah,
Okay. So I
probably,
remember when you cut the locks off, that was for a season. And because I know people were telling you, even my godmother was telling you cut the locks off, and you only cut them when you heard it was time to cut them. And it's nice to see that you're moving, that might be something different now. But I remember some of our bishops started growing beards when they retired, some of them did other stuff. So it'll be interesting to see what you do in your retirement. Well, your Grace, it has been an honor to have you with us today. And just any final words before we close?
No, just thank you. And thank you, AME Church, for the journey. I'm excited to have been able to do that, what I love in the church that I love.
Well, thank you, Bishop Byfield, and we will see you all on another edition of the Chris Recorder Dialogues.
Yeah, thank you.